factors at play here before we can make any determination about what the intentions are.
Let's talk to Ibrahim Anoba, African Affairs analyst, who joins us from California. Welcome to the program, Ibrahim. Now, over the weekend, U.S.-Saudi mediated talks did take place in the city of Jeddah to find a way to stop the war from escalating in Sudan. Now, how does that influence the conflict if the warring sides are still carrying on with fighting in the capital, Khartoum, and really failing to adhere to a ceasefire?
Well, thanks for having me, Susan. So the talks in Jeddah weren't really to consider any kind of diplomatic end to the conflict. It was primarily about humanitarian aid, allowing aid to come into Sudan. And of course, the RSF and the army have made it clear they are not in any way ready to have conversations about ending this civil war. It's more so about humanitarian. However, I think it's also speak to the fact that now the international community is paying greater attention to the crisis in Sudan, not only to give both generals leeway as they've been given in the past, but also to consider solutions beyond the military. So there might not be conversations about democratic transition right now, but the effort by the US, by the UN, by Saudi Arabia to bring these generals or their representatives to Jeddah signify that they could also be considering some democratic transition.
And so the United Nations has estimated that the number of internally displaced in Sudan has risen to more than 700,000 people, mostly people who have had to flee to neighboring countries because of the fighting. Now, given this scenario, does this put the burden on the countries taking in the refugees?
I mean, it does. You look at the countries taking these refugees, they are already plagued by their own internal displacements and security crisis. I mean, you look at the countries welcoming majority of refugees from Sudan right now.
Have it ready when I need to talk.
South Sudan is already very pretty much devastated by its own internal security crisis. Remember, there was a flood in 2022 that displaced thousands of people. And before now, there is hunger crisis. It's a country at the brink of famine. You look at a country like Chad, which is also welcoming refugees from Sudan. Chad has been plagued by the attacks by Boko Haram over the years. You look at the Central African Republic, it also has its own internal strife. And even Ethiopia, which is pretty much the big brother in the region, has about 2.3 million people displaced because of the war in the Tigray region. So, I mean, you look at all these neighboring countries, they have their own internal displacements, and it brings a lot of pressure on their infrastructure and their ability to entertain these people living in Sudan that desperately need assistance in the respective countries that they are going to.
Would you say that it's safe to say that this crisis is really a power struggle between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces? And if that's the case, who's in control as it stands now?
I mean, it is purely a power struggle between these two greedy generals, and there doesn't seem to be any clear indication of who is in charge. There were reports coming out of Khartoum yesterday that there have been massive airstrikes by the army on RSF positions, and the RSF having surface-to-air missiles repelling some of those attacks. I mean, this is the same narrative we've had in the last couple of weeks. So there doesn't seem to be an indication that the army is in charge, even though many in the international community want the army to be in charge. Egypt supports the army, supports Burhan. There are indications that even the US may also be indicating some interest in pursuing some form of stability through the army, even though its long-term intention will be for the country to have democratic transition. However, there doesn't seem to be any form of control, which is also making humanitarian relief effort difficult. The UNHCR is often known to work with infrastructures in places where people need assistance. However, when you do not have an indication of who is in charge, it's really difficult to make aid go to people who actually need those aid. So I don't think neither the army or the RSF can claim authority in Sudan at this point.
And let me ask you this, Ibrahim. Now, is this becoming a kind of proxy war? The reason I ask is that there are reports that the Wagner Group have been supplying Sudan's rapid support forces with missiles. And then you have the fact that reports of Hemedti being close ties with Russia. What do you make of all of that?
I mean, we wouldn't want to ignore that fact because, of course, it's clear the Wagner Group is very much active in Sudan and the region generally. And of course, there has been a report by the Washington Post and I think maybe CNN as well, indicating that there have been smuggling of gold out of Sudan by the Wagner Group to fund Russia's war in Ukraine. And of course, in return, many of these army persons in Sudan are getting firearms. I mean, Sudan doesn't manufacture its own gun. It doesn't manufacture its own bomb. So we are seeing all this still perpetrating the crisis in Khartoum and elsewhere. So the guns are coming from somewhere. And the fact that these generals are still able to conduct trade, even if it's the clandestine or black market trade, to buy weapons, it means there are still people in the international system, state actors or non-state actors, who are supporting these generals. And until sanctions come down heavily on those who are supporting both generals, I do not think there will be any yield by either party.
Well, let's look at this from an economic perspective, Ibrahim. If this crisis is to come to an end, eventually, how does the country scale up efforts and pick up the pieces in terms of rebuilding and transitioning back to a more stable economy?
I mean, you know what, Susan, before now, Sudan is already ravaged by a lot of economic crisis. I mean, about 30% of its population lives below the poverty line. And I think close to 20% of the country is actually unemployed as well. And it also has one of the highest level of inflation on the continent, I think about 400%. So you think about all these economic figures, you already see a country in dire need of economic revamping before this crisis, then bring in this crisis, which has destroyed a lot of transportation infrastructure, caused a lot of trade relations with many neighboring countries like South Sudan. A lot of investors that have actually fled the country, SMEs have gone down. So you see a lot of economic edict that will come into play for any government that win or succeeds this crisis. So it's an unfortunate situation, that economic situation that is already dire because of famine, droughts, climate change, COVID-19, now being exacerbated by this civil war. And it's just so unfortunate that the Sudanese people are in the front line bearing those brunt.
My final question to you, could this crisis cause an economic turmoil in the Horn of Africa?
I mean, I think we're already seeing that because Sudan is strategically located on the Red Sea, and it's the outlet for many countries like, I think, the Central African Republic and Chad, who do not have access to, I mean, these countries do not have access to any waters. And Sudan is pretty much their only outlet into the Red Sea. So if Sudan is already plagued by a crisis, it means many of these countries cannot, conduct trade through the Red Sea. So it's really important that Sudan gets stabilized really soon, so not to continue exacerbate the internally displaced refugee problem, but also about the economic situation in the entire region, which is already plagued by insecurity. So you don't want to have insecurity and have economic insecurity at the same time. So the more we consider that as this negotiation goes on, the better it is for everybody in the region.
All right, thank you very much, Ibrahim Anoba, our African Affairs analyst from California. Appreciate you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.